Det var jo de årene da en hadde nok så sterke indre brytninger. Indre brytninger.
Hei og velkommen til Noen har snakket sammen, en podcast fra Agenda Magasin. Mitt navn Aksel Fjellavli.
Og jeg heter Tiril Rustan Halvorsen.
I dag skal vi snakke om høyrepopulisme, litt om ekstremisme, hvordan de henger sammen, og hvordan status egentlig i dag. Etter Trump gikk av har det jo ikke vært så mye fokus på populisme som mens han satt som president, men likevel så det jo, har de jo makta i mange land, blant annet så det jo Sverigedemokraterne jo støtteparti for den svenske regjeringen, og det jo ganske unprecedented at man har liksom et tidligere naziparti i den rollen i Sverige da.
Ja, og en kjent forsker på området, Cas Mudde, i landet, så da inviterte vi han i studio.
Nettopp, han professor ved University of Georgia, og også tilknyttet det som heter CREX, som Senter for studier av ekstremisme, som i Oslo da. Så du skal nå få høre et intervju med Cas Mudde. Cas Mudde, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just start with some like definitions to get a grasp of what populism is about. And there is one thing that you wrote one time, that populism is in essence an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. What do you mean by that?
So liberal democracy, which is really the democratic system that we have and generally referred to as democracy, is actually a combination of two traditions, a liberal tradition and a democratic tradition. And if you want to keep it very simple, then the democratic tradition is about majority rule. Now, the liberal tradition is about minority rights. And obviously, there's a tension between them. Like sometimes majorities want to do stuff that harms minorities, and in a pure democracy, like whatever the majority wants, they get. But in our system, you can't do certain things, like you can't take away basic rights from minorities. And so there's always this tension between the liberal and the democratic tradition. Now, I speak about populism as illiberal democracy because in populism, the people are homogeneous. And they only see two groups, the people who are pure of heart, and the elite that are corrupt. And because the elite is corrupt, they are not legitimate, which leaves only one group. Now, because that group is homogeneous, and every person who is part of the people has the same interest and values, you get ultimate majority rule. Because there are no minority rights to protect, because the only minority are the corrupt elite. So in that sense, they're democratic, as in majority rule, but they're illiberal because they don't like minority rights. Now, undemocratic liberalism is what I describe as the process that we have gone through over the last decades, particularly because of neoliberalism, but to a certain extent of Europeanization, where liberal protections, be that either through the courts or through the market, have undermined democracy. And so as an example, there are a lot of things that have been privatized. By privatization, you put things outside of the power of the state. But by doing that, you also put them outside of the power of the citizen, particularly of the voter. Like if I now vote, if public transport is privatized and I vote, I cannot influence the public transport policy. other things are more in the cultural realm. So, for example, we have abolished the death penalty. That is now no longer a political debate. If you will talk about it, people will say we can't do that, Council of Europe, etc. Now, it's not about whether that's good or not. My point is that most of these decisions have been taken without fundamental debates and have now limited the democratic sphere. And so, in my opinion, liberal democracy is kind of attacked from two sides. From the illiberal side by populism and from the undemocratic side by mostly neoliberalism.
When we talk about populism now, it's essentially sort of an empty term that can be filled with different kinds of ideologies, right? It can be populist radical right, it can be like a more left-wing populism, it can be agrarian populism, and what we have seen in the last decade especially is a rise of the populist radical right with Trump, right, with Hungary and so on. And you are talking about what is the discontent about? You're talking about neoliberalism and Europeanization and so on. Why is it this nativist strand of populism that has gained more votes and not like it should be more like left-wing populism that should have won on these kind of discontents that you mention here?
Yeah, so it's true populism can be combined with left, right, and possibly all kind of other things. It's not empty, though. And it's not just protest or anti-establishment. So it is a specific way of seeing society. Again, as said, as there are only two groups and they're homogeneous and antagonistic. And populism can and has been combined with both left-wing ideologies, some form of socialism, right-wing ideologies, mostly forms of nativism, xenophobic nationalism. And it's important that for most populist actors, populism is secondary. And so the nativism is more important than the populism for the populist radical right. And you see that also in the case of parties like the Danish People's Party or even the Sweden Democrats, when they become more accepted, the populism kind of diminishes because the elite is no longer like so corrupt because they now like them. But the nativism never wavers. Like it might become less central in the campaign depending on which topics are there, but it's the core of them. Now, why is that more important in this time than socialism, for example, like after the Great Recession? I think that's partly it's very difficult to argue. I mean, in many ways, rationally, it doesn't make sense that some form of radical left or just old school social democracy isn't more successful today. But in the late 1990s, you saw a convergence on socioeconomic policies of the center-left and the center-right, mostly because the Social Democrats went to the middle. As a consequence, competition on socioeconomics became more difficult because they were the same. And then 9/11 hit, which brought issues like identity, security, Islam, immigration all to the fore, and everything was now about social-cultural issues, particularly identity, security issues, which are issues where nativism comes in, right? And so I think a lot has to do with what we talk about. And as long as we talk primarily about issues related to identity, immigration, security, then nativism is one of the best sellers.
Noen har snakket sammen i samarbeid med Dagsavisen.
Det stemmer, og en sak som jeg synes var ganske slående i Dagsavisen denne uka her, var den saken om Oslo fengsel, der de bekymret for liv og helse på grunn av manglende ressurser. Den anbefaler jeg å lese, fordi dette en sånn gjentagende sak der Norge får liksom kritikk fra internasjonale menneskerettighetsorganisasjoner, torturkomiteer, alt mulig for forhold i norske fengsel. Og en del av det handler om også ressurser. Og regjeringen har jo bevilget en del penger til fengslene i revidert nasjonalbudsjett. Jeg tenker at denne saken viser at det er rom for å bruke også litt mer penger på fengslene, og den saken i Dagsavisen illustrerer det egentlig på en god måte da.
Og enda verre står det til i kvinnefengsler.
Absolutt.
Ja.
Så ja, et langt lerret å bleke der.
Dagsavisen der, altså. Is there some kind of a democratic force to this also, that we heard that people that normally doesn't vote for these parties, so you get more activation of people who doesn't normally participate in the democracy? Is that...
So that depends. In certain countries, the largest group of voters are new voters, which includes first-time voters and people who didn't vote the election before, but might have voted many times before that. Even if that is the case, it generally is a minority. And so about 20% of their voters come from new voters at best, because the vast majority in most cases come from their old voters and then from all the other parties. There is an element to it. There was some research that showed, for example, when the Danish People's Party did well, about 10 years ago or something, then satisfaction with democracy in Denmark went up. Mm-hmm. And logically, that would be from those people, right, who feel now more represented. But you also see in countries like the Netherlands, where almost for 25 years now, politicians have been catering to pretty much the radical right voter, that the radical right voter still feels like that no one listens to them and no one cares about them. So there is a group for whom nothing is ever enough, right? And there is another group that feels that finally they have a voice. Now, quite often the populist radical right disappoints that group, often by going into power. And I mean, they have this weird type of split, which many opposition parties have, that they push their key point, but they also promise everything. Yeah. And then when in power, they have to choose. And of course, they always choose nativism, because that's the core. But that can lead then to socioeconomic policies that hurt their electorate very hard. And so these people can come out of that even more disappointed in the system and perhaps never voting again. The cop-out for an academic, but it is unfortunately the truth, is that we don't have the data, because to actually find this, you need panel data. You need to ask the same person over like 20 years how they voted. And we have very limited data.
The question then for us on the center left, but also for people on the center right, is what strategy do you choose to counter that? And if you look at Scandinavia, you have over time had a couple of different strategies from the social democratic parties. You mentioned the Danish social democrats, which have chosen to sort of accommodate on nativism and move closer to the Danish People's Party on immigration issues. You have the Swedish social democrats, which have at least over quite a period of time tried to say that the Swedish Democrats are Nazis and should not be touched at all. And then you have the Norwegian center-left, the combination of the Social Democrats and the Centre Party, which has had, in the last election, quite an material agenda, both on economic issues, but also on rural-urban issues to redistribute material resources. So, what works? It seems that the pulse of the populist radical right is like 20-30%, regardless of what strategy you choose.
Yeah, so there are two ways that you can answer this question. On the one hand, whenever I talk to people from social democratic parties, then what they think works is what is well for the social democratic party, which is not my concern. I'm a social democrat, but I don't think that many social democratic parties are the best vehicle to implement social democracy. But also, first and foremost, I'm a liberal Democrat. And so what works is what works for liberal democracy. And we do see that, for example, the nativist course for the Danish Social Democrats, which is not catering to. They're absolutely nativist. They brag about being nativist. This is not an opportunistic kind of threat. And that's why it works. I think voters actually really believe that they're going to implement nativist policies. It had short-term success, it seems, although they're polling pretty poorly now. The success, though, is purely for the party, because at the same time, the success is also for nativism, which is now pretty much a non-partisan issue in Denmark. Every single party, with the exception of a few radical left parties, are now nativist, from the center left to the far right and everything in between, which is, of course, terrible for any type of minority in the country. Sweden is now pretty much doing the same, but with much less success, undoubtedly, because they're not like authentically nativist, and so any voter will know that. And if you're a voter for whom immigration is important, you vote for Sweden Democrats, because the lesson you learned from the last 2 years is that only a strong Sweden Democrats will move other parties to the right on immigration. And so what we see is when you copy their issues, when you copy their frames, that you might have a short-term success as your party, but the radical right always wins because they own those issues of immigration. And so what you do is you make those issues more important. That's why you make them more important. So the best thing is, to a certain extent, what Norway has done, although let's not forget that in terms of policies, under the Social Democrats, they were also very strict on immigration, but mostly without the nativist rhetoric, which, I mean, let's be clear, you can be liberal democratic and for very tight immigration. It's about your argumentation. And so here, nativism hasn't been particularly strong. I think that has partly to do with a very controlled policy. It has partly to do with a relatively moderate radical right party, and I'm not even sure it is one. And luck, probably, because capturing an agenda is very hard. But what mainstream parties should try to do is do exactly that. For the last 2 decades, they have been talking about the agenda set by the radical right, with help of the media, but still, they haven't talked about issues that concern many of their voters, which is housing, which is education, which is healthcare. If you talk about those issues, voters want something else than the radical right, because the radical right doesn't have much to offer, right? So set your own agenda, have clear, and particularly for the Social Democrats, bold policies, because social democratic parties are invisible in many countries because they're kind of have non- or centrist positions both on socioeconomics and sociocultural, which means that that's fine for their electorate, which literally is dying in most countries. They're well in their 60s. But many young people want to know what you stand for. And they look at the Greens and they think, okay, like they stand for like clearly progressive sociocultural policies. Now, socioeconomically, they might be a bit too libertarian, but then you look at the Social Democrats and you think, I don't know exactly where you stand sociocultural. And socioeconomically, you seem to kind of be okay with the market, but also not so much, right? And so I think you need to be visible, but you also need to be consistent, right? And I think that's the other weakness of particularly social democratic parties. If you just look over the last 3-4 decades, they've been almost all over the place on both socioeconomic and sociocultural points.
But how important has Russia been in the development and growth of the radical right, especially in Europe and maybe in the US? We saw before the invasion that frequent meetings between Putin and leaders of parties in Europe. How and in what way has influence been?
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a detractor there, but I think virtually none.
Okay.
We've had over a decade of almost all major newspapers, intelligence agencies, everything look into the money streams. They came up with almost nothing. We have all of the disinformation type things. First of all, this is a small part of the disinformation out there, and much of the research shows that disinformation has a very limited effect, only on a very small group. In the US, they estimate about 10% of Trump voters. And also importantly is that with regard to the disinformation, mostly what Russia does is amplify existing problems. Like, I mean, at a certain point in time, we had the weirdest discussion in the US where people by and large accused Russia of bringing racism into the US. It's like the whole country is founded on racism. Like, you don't need Russia to play that up. And so that's mostly the case. There has been a bit of a role in the sense that far-right parties, particularly when they were marginalized or stigmatized, would go to Russia and meet with United Russia and sometimes Putin, but it's remarkable how few times he actually met with a radical right leader. And so for someone like Marine Le Pen, this might have been useful because she's so stigmatized in France. And so she can show, look, I'm stigmatized here in France, but I met with the Russian president. But in most countries, the radical right is like mainstreamed till broadly accepted. They don't need to go abroad to show that they're a realistic partner, right? I mean, take the Sweden Democrats. I mean, all the right-wing parties pretty much already said that they would govern with them. So in that sense, that effect was small. And I think you see it with the Ukraine war. I mean, almost every relevant far-right party has dropped Putin, like overnight. Not to say that they won't come back once he becomes less toxic. But what it shows the sport was never ideological. Most are against the unipolar world. And most are against the liberal world order / the EU. And they see Putin, but also Trump, of course, as kind of important counterweights to that.
So basically hold back your conspiracy theories on Russia and the populist radical right.
Yeah, I personally think that much of Russiagate in the US was conspiracy theory. And I'm not saying that they didn't try to meddle. I think it's like a bit hypocritical for the Americans to be like so judgy about it, because we've been meddling in elections all the time, the US, but also the EU. Like we support opposition parties somewhere. We have a lot of discourse around elections. So it happened. Russia happened too, but there's no evidence that it swung the election.
One thing that has been striking me the last couple of years is that, at least from a Norwegian point of view, immigration is less prominent on the agenda in the discourse. But regardless of that, the populist radical right is polling quite well across countries. Do you think that gender issues, climate issues are enough to hold the populist radical right up on the polls, or do they need immigration and nativist issues?
So I think it's important that immigration is actually two issues. It's immigration, people coming in, and it's integration, people are already here. Immigration was close to zero outside of family reunion for a long time until pretty much the so-called refugee crisis. It's incredibly hard to immigrate into the EU or Switzerland or Norway, right? And so it was family reunion, which is almost outside of the realm of politics because it's regulated at higher levels. Integration is an issue that's always there because all societies have become multicultural, irrespective of how much. In many countries, it's not that much, but often, like take Norway, like in the capital, like it's very visible. And you can exploit that all the time, in part because the media will do it. Like whenever there's a crime that has an immigrant link, like that will be played up, particularly if it's like a sexual crime or something. And that's everything like that you need for a scandal. But they're not a single issue party, and they never have been. Like the problem with climate change and even so-called gender ideology or wokeness or whatever the term is that that's not exclusive. That's not their exclusive topic. Nativism they own. Like even if others like copy it, everyone knows that they are nativist and they mean it. Climate change skeptics you have everywhere. Right? Conservatives own that as much as the radical right. And the radical right really only has populism on that. Although they're clever, they always make a link to nativism that's linked to immigration or something like that. And gender ideology is, again, works for the radical right, but also for the mainstream right, also for the Christian right. And so you have more competition there. And I think that what we have seen over the last years, is that they don't need immigration to be the top issue. It makes them more central, but they can survive on others, generally not at the same high level. I mean, almost every radical right party peaked in the wake of the so-called refugee crisis, 2015-16, to levels that they never actually achieved in elections later. But in Finland, for example, it was an election which was a lot about climate change. The Finns won. In the Netherlands, we had the same with a regional election. Forum won. And they do this by making it into a populist issue. And so sometimes they fully deny climate change. Sometimes they say it's there, but it is exaggerated by the elite to hold on to power. And they make policies where you, the people, pay the big price, whereas the ones who are actually doing the polluting stay like out of shot. And to a certain extent, it is true, because most of the measures that we take on climate are kind of flat taxes, in the sense that we tax everyone at the same level. So if you put a huge tax on flying, for example, like that hurts poor people much more than rich people. Like business people are still going to fly, right? But poor people can no longer fly. It's the same with taxes on gasoline. Like if the gas goes up with 10 cents on the liter, right? If you make 250,000, that's no problem. If you make 36,000, that could be the difference between whether you drive or not drive, right? And so as long as we have these type of flat tax policies on climate change, they can use this for their populist discourse, but it will never sell in the way that anything related to national identity sells.
We wanted to talk a bit about extremism and violent radical rights as well. And Jakob Ravndal, who is a researcher at CREX in Oslo, he has claimed that when you debate immigration openly, and of course the populist radical right is a big part of that, there is less right-wing extreme violence. What do you think about the link between the discourse and how you debate immigration and the violence from the extreme right?
So, as a major caveat, I don't study violence, and I think Jakob's work is very good, but I think the study that he, in which he makes this claim, has issues. I think it has limitations. And one of the major limitations is the type of violence. And so he has a very high bar for violence. His data set, initial data set, is about killings, is about lethal violence, which is only a very small part of violence, of racist violence. And so in 2015, 2016, in Sweden, the Netherlands, in Germany, you had dozens of violent attacks to asylum seeker homes, intimidation, threats of violence to politicians, etc. That has a massive effect on how democracy works. First of all, minorities feel threatened, not just asylum seekers. Like, I mean, don't think that your average non-white immigrant thinks, oh, it's just asylum seekers. They will be fine with me because I'm legally here. Right? They feel intimidated. But also, politics is heavily affected because people start to self-censor. Because if you speak out in favor of an asylum seeker center in your community or in favor of immigration, you get threatened. Now, the fact that you're not killed, is very good, but it still affects how you operate. And so we have seen that. Like, you see very few people come out in support of these things, which is not just because the people don't want it, which actually is much more complex than that. And so I think in general, it's important to discuss any political issue that is relevant to a significant part of the population. And immigration is one of them. I don't think we have actually been debating it much. In most countries, we were allegedly all for it until 9/11, although we weren't really. It was just the, let's say, politically correct discourse that we all said multiculturalism is great, etc., etc. Since 9/11, roughly speaking, we have all declared it a failure and immigration a problem. And now all the discussion is about how little immigration. How do we make it the least of a problem? That's not a debate. Like, a debate is with fundamentally different positions. We can even debate whether immigration is first and foremost about national identity or whether it is first and foremost about the economy. I mean, immigration is now reduced to a frame about national identity, national security. For decades, it was about immigration. For other decades, it was mostly a legal issue of, like, how can we, like, integrate people in this. I think it's also important, violence is incredibly low, particularly lethal violence. And I think generalizations are really problematic. Take Norway, right? You take the person I won't name by name out of the equation, like the number of killings by far right goes down to almost nothing. Right? In many countries, that is the case. We're talking about a few individuals. There's so many things that come into play to explain that I'm always a bit worried about giving big social explanations for the behavior of what is in most cases a handful of people.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask, because now we have a lot of Ukrainian immigrants coming to Norway, and much more than we had in 2015, but there's no debate. And I mean, it's broadly accepted, and money is being spent on national budgets with almost no opposition. What's that about?
Well, so this is the case across pretty much Europe. The Netherlands has shown a phenomenal state capacity that allegedly was nowhere to be found in 2015-16. Numbers are a bit lower in the Netherlands, but still. We have local communities compete with each other to get Ukrainian refugees. So it's easy to say it's racism, but it is partly racism. These are white people. The others weren't white people. And importantly, the others were Muslims. And since 9/11, Islamophobia has been very important in our debate about identity. But it's not just racism. So there are two other elements that I think are a difference between Ukraine and Syria. First of all, Syria is a civil war, whereas Ukraine is an external war. This is important in terms of feeling there's a clear good side and a bad side, which, al-Assad versus ISIS, a bit difficult to see where you stand, right? And so that's important. Second, what is important about that is that civil wars just continue. And the idea is, after a civil war, people don't want to go back for a long time. The narrative we have about Ukraine, whether right or wrong, was Ukraine was doing great. Then the Russians came, destroyed everything. The idea behind that is, once Russia goes, Ukraine will be great, and Ukrainians go back. It's a very different narrative. And the third one, which is also very important, as in everything, there's an element of egocentrism here. Like, we have a narrative that if Ukraine falls, we will be next. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not, but it's a narrative which makes us connected to Ukrainians. We don't have that about Syria. Like, partly because of racism, like those are issues that happen there. They will never happen to us. But partly also because al-Assad is not coming for us next, right? And so it is very complex. And then the final thing, why the acceptance is bigger, they can work. And so in the Netherlands, asylum seekers often for years and years are in the process of being registered and everything, and they can't work, which means they cost a lot of money, as well as they're hanging around idly and all those kind of things. Ukrainians can work pretty much from day one, right? Which makes them actually very attractive, particularly for local communities that have seen an outflux of younger people. So, I mean, it is truly first-class and second-class asylum seekers, and I think it is crucial to note the racism, but I think it's also important not to reduce it to it. If it would have been a civil war in Ukraine, for example, I think the tolerance would not be this high.
I think also to challenge your point number, which one was it? The last one. I think that the Ukrainian war has framed Ukrainians as heroes, like a simple story about resourceful heroes, and you also equate that with it's easy to get them to work because they have long education and are easy to integrate, but it's not necessarily the case as much as people think. Many come here with low education credentials, have a hard time learning the language and so on. So, I think that's part of the picture as well.
Yeah, I think so too. And let's not forget that, like, for example, almost 1 million Syrians that went to Germany, about 1/3 is now in a job, 1/3 is in education, and then 1/3 is in the category that we all the time talk about that everyone is in. I think there's a very important gender element to it as well. And so Ukrainians are mostly, but definitely not exclusively, women and children. Many of the refugees of 2015-16 were mostly men, which has explanations which have to do with patriarchy, as well as the fact that you're being called to fight. Now you can say, well, they should fight for their country, but in Syria you fight either for ISIS or you fight for al-Assad, and then there's some other issues, right? There's not a clear good side. So if it would be Syria being invaded, for the sake of argument, by Iran, right, then there's a fair chance that a sizable group of these men would actually fight. But again, it's a civil war versus another one. And so the gender element is very important. But again, the racism is important, right? Because it's like, if it would be Ukrainian men coming, yes, there would be less understanding than Ukrainian women and children. But there would still be more understanding than when Muslim men were coming.
One final thing that I wanted to ask you is that there is a commission on extremism working now in Norway. They are publishing their report in December, I think. So they still probably have a bit of work to do. I wondered if, from your perspective, mostly on working on the populist radical right, but also in the fringes around with extremist and violent right-wing actors, is there some kind of advice from the global research field you would hand over to them?
I mean, there are mostly a lot of bad examples. And so we can say, don't do that. I think, first of all, in terms of responses to far-right violence, Norway has responded almost as well as we have seen to the infamous person I won't name by name attacks. Like, it hasn't securitized the state. It hasn't gone on this kind of like fear spree. And like the argument was what everyone says after these type of attacks: they attacked our values and we won't change them. But most do change them. I think Norway has done a great job, certainly not perfect, but overall a great job to continue as they did, understanding that first and foremost, this was a deranged individual who is part of a larger network and narrative, right? But also an exceptional part of that, and that you don't securitize your country over that, because that would negatively affect millions of people to potentially stop like one or two other people. So I hope that the new report will stick with that. I think one of the things I've seen in other countries, particularly the one I live at in the United States over the years, is because of the mainstreaming of the radical right, the far right that is discussed as a threat moves more and more to the fringes. And so it's a very good example here, like CREX, with the institute that I'm affiliated with, was founded by the conservative populist right-wing government. Obviously, they didn't found that center with the idea that they were going to study the Progress Party. Like they were going to study the real radical right. We now have a debate in the US about domestic violent extremism. That was white supremacy. Right? But white supremacy couldn't be it, because then the Republicans wouldn't choose it. I've spoken to people from who are linked to that committee and others, and most of the time we would talk for an hour about which term they could use. And almost all the terms they would say, oh, we can't do that because the Republicans wouldn't sign off on that. And so most of the time I don't actually talk to these committees for the simple reason that for me, the threat doesn't come from individuals. It doesn't even come from smaller violent groups like the Proud Boys or Nordic resistance movement. The threat to liberal democracy across the world comes from within the system. It comes from Trump, it comes from Bolsonaro, it comes from Orban. But these forces are so mainstream now that they are on these committees. And so to be able to talk about the far right, we have to stay far away from the ones that have been mainstream, which means that now in the US we talk about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers at a time like that one of the two parties is fundamentally anti-democratic, denies the results of probably the best organized election in US history, openly supports a coup d'etat and argues that it was just a tourism trip, voter suppression through the roof in all kind of countries, right? But that is all not part of our debate. No, it's the Proud Boys that are the problem and the Oath Keepers. And so I think what you need to be really worried about is what implicitly such a research does. Because if your report is on extremism as a whole or on the far right as a whole, but you limit it to only a small subset, what you by and large implicitly do is argue that all the other ones are not radical right, which means you normalize and mainstream them. I think this is one of the biggest problems. Like, I've now been traveling for almost 4 weeks through Europe, and almost everywhere I come, people are discussing with me, oh, but is the Brothers of Italy really a radical right party? Aren't they conservative? Are the Sweden Democrats like really radical right? Are they conservative? Is Vox really radical right, really conservative? I mean, if I would give someone in the 1990s like a program of Vox or Brothers of Italy or Sweden Democrats and ask, is this a radical right party? There will be no debate. Right? But now we have shifted so far that even like party that originated in a neo-Nazi movement or a party that's built on the fascist infrastructure or a party that dweeps with like Franco are now considered like totally within the liberal democratic order. And so these type of investigations can help that by focusing on everything to the right of it, which gives the impression to people that that is the only extremism/far right that there is.
Cas Mudde, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
Ja, Aksel, vi avslutter vel både episoden og sesongen, trolig, med en anbefaling. Eller noen anbefalinger, kanskje.
Ja, ikke sant. Altså, vi burde jo egentlig lagd en fotballepisode med Cas, for både før og etter episoden var det jo...
Bare snakk om fotball.
Ja, og jeg har jo fulgt Cas på Twitter i mange år, og det er egentlig min anbefaling å gjøre det. Han heter Cas Mudde på Twitter. Både mye interessant om det temaet vi har snakket om i dag, og også en del fotball. Han driver og reiser rundt til stadioner og ser på fotball i lavere divisjoner. Blant annet hadde han vært en tur opp i Hammerfest nå, mens han var her i Norge og sett Hammerfest mot Tromsø 2.
Og så var han ikke videre imponert over det norske landslaget.
Nei, det er kanskje flere som deler den oppfatningen.
Yes.
Hva med deg, Tiril?
Altså, jeg tror hjernen min har tatt ferie allerede. Jeg kom ikke på noen anbefalinger.
Shame,
jeg er helt
shame.
tom for anbefalinger. Så jeg trenger input i løpet av sommeren, så send gjerne meg noen anbefalinger. Eneste jeg kan anbefale er les Agenda Magasin og hør på Noen har snakket sammen.
Ja, det er for Tåle som er anbefaling god som noe.
Da sier vi god sommer da, mest sannsynlig.
Mest sannsynlig. Takk for nå.
Takk for nå.